Parents can really mess you up. Most don't mean to, but everyone carries some generational trauma. The Gallagher children were handed a particularly bad hand with the father like Frank Gallagher. Despite his many children, Frank wanders the streets, spouting conspiracies and rambling philosophies, coping with modern frustrations through alcohol, drugs, and women. I want to compare the two Franks, Frank Gallagher from the original Shameless UK, and then Frank Gallagher from Shameless US. Let's start with the outright answer. Frank Gallagher from Shameless US is worse. He's way worse. He's actually such a terrible human being to the point that out of the two Franks, he was the one that the writers decided had to die by the end of the show. But let's start at the beginning with Shameless UK.
There are some people, one or two people, who say that Shameless glamorises crime and drinking and drugs, glamorises the subject it occupies.
And? No, but you know, they wouldn't argue with that. You know, if they, you know, it's like Frank, or give us a pint and a couple of these. You know, that's what they do. And you know, it's not, I don't want to glamorise it inside. It's not my perspective that's the way to make it work. But you know, Frank's totally derelict. The fact you don't want to kill him is a really sophisticated piece of processing on the audience's part. That, you know, he should be slaughtered for doing what he does.
The original Frank was played by David Threfall, a British actor and director who got a start in theater doing a lot of plays before getting into more dramatic and comedic roles in film and television. This gave the British depiction of Frank the tongue of a Shakespearean poet, but the antics of an outlandish clown.
See, the trouble with you is you put it all down to faith. Faith. Well, people haven't got fucking faith. It's all drip, drip, drip. Drought, famine, tsunami. Drip, drip, drip.
Just things are getting worse out here, you know. Just getting fucking worse. So you think, fuck him, let him sit on his cloud twiddling his beard. As flies to wanton boys, a weed to the gods.
And like a clown, Frank has no desire to be serious or responsible for his plethora of kids. Playing an asshole dad isn't the most complex role, but when Frank wasn't being an asshole, he was somewhat lovable. He spoke about the working class and the inequalities they faced due to the government. You wanted to root for Frank because deep down, it was clear that he cared about people and his family, but he still was a self-serving alcoholic drug addict. And so throughout the show, we watch Frank widely sway between being a shitty drunk and an almost decent person.
I sort of swanned about between, well, he's not threatening to men.
You've got a fucking nerve, Gallagher.
You know, and he's not threatening to women. But in the end, I came round to the idea that I think people love him because I'm playing him, and I'm really, really nice.
The beauty of David being a director and an actor is he comes from an actor's perspective with you. I kind of feel every time I work with him I'm getting an acting lesson.
As I mentioned in my Galavich video, both versions of Shameless followed similar storylines at the beginning of the show, but veered down different paths. We can see Frank following similar behaviors in season 1 of the UK and US versions. In this, we can see how both depictions balance a sense of dark humor with dramatic moments to create an unpredictability that matches the most heightened instances of life. Frank is not just a nuisance to the Gallaghers, but to the wider community who we get to see him interact with. They also do this in Shameless US.
Give me the money.
Frank?
What? No. I'll use it.
For what? To jack off? Go home.
But in the UK version, there are more character storylines removed from the Gallagher family entirely, especially with how the Maguire family were elevated to lead roles in the later seasons when the Gallagher children began to trickle out of the series. Fun fact, there were 11 seasons of both versions, with Shameless UK having 139 episodes and Shameless US having 134 episodes. Frank was the only person to appear in all episodes of the UK and US one. Also, the US one had all the Gallagher kids except Fiona throughout the whole show, along with Kev and Veronica, compared to Shameless UK, where Frank would end up being one of the only ones left of the original Gallagher family. Regardless, we were able to see how both characters evolved throughout their aligned storylines, with Frank being more comedic in the British version and the tone being more lighthearted, while in the US version, Frank is more dramatic, despite it also being a comedy. Frank is also an offbeat character, which was well suited for William H. Macy, who was known for taking on slightly skewed, almost comedic characters in otherwise dramatic films.
There's some degree of inebriation in everything I do. Sometimes more, sometimes less. That makes everything really fun. I mean, I have a poetical license to kill.
He's just a tremendous actor and a comedian, and is one of those actors who's able to do something that's comedic and yet keep it completely grounded in a real character.
It's important to discuss the eras when these Franks arrived. Manchester Frank arrived during the 2000s, when British television was taking on a more realistic yet satirical look at life through shows like The Office and Peep Show. This was when the UK was pretty financially stable, entering the new millennium right before the 2008 global financial crisis. So working class people were looked down upon by those in the upper classes who were not feeling the negative economic effects yet. Manchester Frank was also an ex-con with multiple children and eventually wives. So he was a great character to anchor the show around, to explore how societal issues affect working class families. Manchester Frank was merely an extreme depiction of the working class man from government housing. For her comedic effect and to juxtapose the traditional depiction of TV fathers up to that point, Frank subverted this stereotypical patriarch and flipped the nuclear family on its head with the rowdy Gallaghers. Even the stylization of the show feels more raw and fits with the show's working class theme. With Chicago Frank, he was also an ex-con with multiple children and wives, but he came about in the early 2010s when the TV anti-hero character was at its peak with Walter White, Nancy Botwin, Don Draper, and Dexter Morgan. During this time, we have the added societal elements of the 2008 Great Recession in America, when the economy tanked due to the subprime mortgage crisis and the bank bailouts. So these characters were more altruistic for audiences as they lied, schemed, and manipulated their way out of situations. Due to the state of the world, we saw entertainment as an affordable escapism, as television garnered more praise and respect for its growing budgets, wild plots, and iconic criminally rebellious leads. We saw more storylines revolving around Chicago Frank and his criminal hijinks, continuously fucking over everybody he ever gets close to.
How did I get cancer?
You must have caught it from Grammy, son. If she had known that she had the contagious kind, I don't think she would have spent so much time with you in the basement cooking meth.
Am I going to die?
I hope not.
With Manchester Frank, though notorious for his scheming, he was more relaxed and more so went about trying to avoid responsibility wherever it arose. He preferred to do the bare minimum necessary, while Chicago Frank always put more effort into his day-to-day schemes to get the same level of satisfaction. They were both always opportunists down on their luck, but besides money, they had different challenges that held them back from evolving and changing for the better due to the circumstances. As the series continues, we see not only his already shaky relationship with Fiona burn out over and over again, but with the rest of his children as well. We can also see that both Franks may have other kids.
Monica, at your 21st birthday party, when you were passed out on the coats, I shagged your mother. You know that surprise late baby that your mum and dad never planned? You know, your little sister. Technically, she's also your stepdaughter.
The character Sammy, Chicago Frank's long-lost eldest daughter, doesn't really exist in the original version, but it shows how deceptive the newer version of Frank is, as he only reaches out to her because he needs a liver transplant due to him abusing his own. We can see her full arc going from adoring Frank to learning who he really is and becoming another one of his kids that he has let down.
Dad never came home with my trailer.
He's not coming home with her trailer.
What?
There's no money. Never will be.
But Dad said...
He lied. To Gallagher rite of passage, realizing he let you down. He always will. Hey, it means you really are Gallagher now.
Looking at Frank's relationship with his community, he is notoriously hated. Whether Frank owes someone money or has fucked someone over otherwise, Frank's vagabond lifestyle is he never truly cares about others, with few exceptions. Frank is consistently the worst person in most situations, but eventually we do actually see Manchester and Chicago Frank try to be a better person.
Hey, then think on this, Constable. That is my daughter in there. If you ruin her life by blowing your charming but deeply flawed Celtic brains all over my backyard, I will piss on your grave each and every fucking day. That I promise you. And don't be a dafty.
But at the same time, both Franks do terrible things, such as Manchester Frank putting a dog in a bag and throwing him off a bridge. It's just played off comically as the dog eventually comes back to him and becomes his pet at Sheila's house. It's ironic because in Shameless US, after Frank ruins Fiona's wedding,
Lip's drinking his breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Ian's a bipolar queer. Deb's 15 with a baby on her hip. And Carl thinks he's a brother. And Fiona, my beautiful Fiona, you've let so many men drive up the freeway between your legs, you're gonna have to put an exit sign on your vagina.
they throw him off a bridge. And that's also played off comically, despite the Gallagher kids, Kev, and V all under the impression that they may have murdered Frank, and that was just all okay. But again, like the dog in Shameless UK, Shameless US also juxtaposes this moment in showing how Frank is so bad that he's not even a man in his family's eyes and is no more than a pitiful animal that they've all lost empathy for. Even in all his romantic relationships, Frank was always a disappointment. He treated Sheila Jackson horribly and uses her for a place to stay after his kids kick him out of the house. Sheila is into kink, so Frank appeases her, but he doesn't enjoy it, and Sheila doesn't care. There's no real connection between them, but Frank manipulates her into believing he's invested in their relationship. Manchester Frank and Sheila had twins, while Chicago Frank and Sheila did not. This made Manchester Frank and Sheila's relationship more significant. In Shameless UK, Sheila only left Frank once Monica came back into town and Frank started cheating with her.
I'm sorry I made you wait. It's you.
I'm not a dishcloth. I'm leaving you.
Simplest thing in the world. I choose you.
In the US version, Sheila left Frank after he blew up her house.
And you are a certified whack job. What? Couldn't go out of your house for 2 years. You take great pleasure in shoving fake penises up the butts of the men you love.
For Manchester Frank, it's only when he meets married Rosie and later epileptic librarian Libby where we see Frank pursue women with any sense of romantic innocence. However, neither works out as Frank always goes back to Monica.
I can't have sex. If my BP goes above 120/80, my heart explodes. If we fuck, I die.
Good afternoon. Is this patient 13437-917?
Yes. Oh, well, her husband.
There was a bus crash on Interstate 494. We've been informed there may be a heart available.
She doesn't need it anymore.
What?
She passed.
The victims had a B-positive heart. A boy from Clark County got it. That was the heart I needed. Take me to the bedroom.
At 354 Crescent Drive. My girlfriend died.
Chicago Frank is less lucky in love, with Monica dying on him after their abusive relationship. Frank later has flings with Queenie, his long-lost daughter Sammy's mom, then also Bianca, a doctor dying of cancer, and Ingrid, a mentally ill therapist who Frank had kids with that are technically Carl's. Frank stealing Carl's sperm to fertilize his girlfriend's eggs easily makes him the worst Frank Gallagher.
Well, they really are irresistible. What the hell? I'll take one.
How to sell your baby on the black market? You're selling this baby.
I'm providing a service.
But going back to his relationships, Chicago Frank did have Mikey, who was a real friend to him and understood his struggles. Manchester Frank didn't really have that. We want to feel bad for Frank sometimes because we see his backstory and sympathize with his struggle. In Shameless UK, Frank's mother dies when he's a kid. His dad was verbally abusive, and when he has a medical emergency, Frank thinks he is dead and runs away.
You vicious, mean, up your own ass old man.
And them's not my words. No, that's what my mum used to call you. And that's the only reason you smiled when I was born. Cause you knew you'd slowed her down.
You take back every single word.
Get fucked.
She totally worshipped me.
She used to piss in your bait box.
In Shameless US, Frank's mother abused him while his father was in and out of jail. Frank's mother even makes his kids feel bad for Frank.
Stuff. My parents suck too.
Both of their childhoods explain why they fall for women who are a little off and are more maternal. To be Frank Gallagher is to neglect your children and search for someone to take care of you instead. The long list of women for both Franks shows that they are both womanizers at the end of the day. Their endings pretty much highlight why Frank Gallagher from Shameless US was worse. In the end, Chicago Frank had to face the consequences of his lifestyle, and he died of alcohol-related dementia. None of his kids, other than Liam, really cared when he got up and disappeared, because by that point, they had already moved on from Frank and wanted very little to do with him. Manchester Frank eventually runs all his children off, and the only one left is his youngest daughter, Stella. However, we see Frank open his home to more people, and the Gallagher house becomes a place of refuge for their community. Frank also takes on more responsibility in the last episode when he's almost about to leave until he runs into Stella holding Ben, Frank's new baby, with Monica.
You're better off with Fiona. I mean, I don't paint eggs or go to the swing park or have teddy bears fucking tea parties. You're better off with her.
You getting on, mate, or what?
Just off. You were a mistake. Don't you get it? You ruined my life the day you were born. Oh, what's that? Another one. Another trap. You ruined my life.
My dad is nice and kind.
I'm kind.
And he never tells me to go away. And he never shouts at me. And he takes me places, and he loves me.
I love you!
I want to go and play on the swings now.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Instead of leaving, Frank's love for his youngest kids overtakes him, and he stays, showing us in this final episode that despite everything, Frank truly loves his kids. The different endings fit both Franks, because as the patriarch of the Gallagher family, Frank's presence was the key to the original's charm, even when he wasn't living in the house. Fiona left after season 2, so Frank had to step up and wait for his kids, which gave him more opportunities to disappoint them, but also to show them glimpses of his love for them. With Fiona not leaving until after season 9 in the US version, Frank's help was required less, since the kids had Fiona. This left Chicago Frank to be more reckless with his time and get into more trouble. Frank Gallagher is really a character study of how long you can root for someone who refuses to learn from their mistakes, while also trying to understand the social structures that aren't set up to support them. Chicago Frank getting dementia in the end really solidified that he would never be able to change, even if he wanted to, but also how Frank was repeatedly failed by the US medical system.
Discharge him from the hospital?
Tonight, perhaps?
Admin is refusing him a bed.
Drugs.
In the past 15 years, Mr. Gallagher has run up over $85,000 in unpaid bills at this hospital alone, not to mention another $32,000 in outpatient services.
He's facing 3 to 6 months of recovery, rehab, physical therapy.
So we're agreed. Tonight, then?
And had to suffer because of it. Comparing the two, Manchester Frank never really suffered physically in the amount that Chicago Frank did, even looking at when both characters received their first real job on the show. Manchester Frank got a job at a burger place and only got fired when he got caught getting off into a man's burger, then later was able to get a job as a school janitor despite it. When Chicago Frank got his first job at the hardware store and was actually promoted, he was attempting to get his life together, but then the store closed and he lost his job, then struggled to get another, so Chicago Frank was worse, and he was also left with harsher consequences compared to Manchester Frank. Shameless UK and Shameless US are both dark comedies of their times, so it makes sense for a modern Frank Gallagher dealing with the world as it advances a lot faster to be more terrible than one who is generally more stable in spite of it all. When it came down to it, one Frank ended up with his wife and kids, while the other ended up dead with none of his loved ones. I guess we also were trying to be a little bit more hopeful and optimistic back when the original ended coming out of the global economic crisis, while the US one ended in 2021 during the lockdown, so things were a bit more depressing. Regardless, Frank Gallagher in both the original and the American version are phenomenal characters that push you to want the best for someone who doesn't necessarily want the best for themselves.
Fake poverty is cheaper drugs now. Fake poverty is cheaper drugs now. Let's go.